Kofi Annan was the 7th Secretary General of the United Nations and was the founder and chair of the Kofi Annan Foundation. In 2001, he and the United Nations were jointly awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace. Kofi Annan was praised for being preeminent in bringing new life to the organization. Norwegian Nobel Committee, October 2001. He died in 2018 after a short illness. Kofi Annan was a Ghanaian diplomat who served as the 7th Secretary General of the United Nations from 1997 to 2006. Annan and the UN were the co-recipients of the 2001 Nobel Peace Prize. He was the founder and chairman of the Kofi Annan Foundation, as well as chairman of the Elders, an international organization founded by Nelson Mandela. Annan joined the United Nations in 1962, working for the World Health Organization's Geneva office. He went on to work in several capacities at the UN headquarters, including serving as the Under-Secretary General for Peacekeeping between March 1992 and December 1996. He was appointed Secretary General on December 13, 1996 by the Security Council and later confirmed by the General Assembly, making him the first office holder to be elected from the UN staff itself. He was re-elected for a second term in 2001 and was succeeded as Secretary General by Ban Ki-moon in 2007. As Secretary General, Annan reformed the UN bureaucracy, worked to combat HIV/AIDS, especially in Africa, and launched the UN Global Compact. He was criticized for not expanding the Security Council and faced calls for his resignation after an investigation into the Oil for Food program, but was largely exonerated of personal corruption. After the end of his term as Secretary General, he founded the Kofi Annan Foundation in 2007 to work on international development. In 2012, Annan was the UN, Arab League Joint Special Representative for Syria to help find a resolution to the ongoing conflict there. Annan quit after becoming frustrated with the UN's lack of progress with regards to conflict resolution. In September 2016, Annan was appointed to lead a UN commission to investigate the Rohingya crisis. He died in 2018 and was given a state funeral. Kofi Annan was born in Kumasi in the Gold Coast, now Ghana, on April 8, 1938. His twin sister Efwa Atta, who died in 1991, shared the middle name Atta, which in the Akan language means twin. Annan and his sister were born into one of the country's Fante aristocratic families. Both of their grandfathers and their uncle were Fante paramount chiefs, and their brother Kobina would go on to become Ghana's ambassador to Morocco. In the Akan names tradition, some children are named according to the day of the week they were born, sometimes in relation to how many children precede them. Kofi in Akan is the name that corresponds with Friday, the day on which Annan was born. The last name Annan in Fante means fourth-born child. Annan said that his surname rhymes with canon in English. From 1954 to 1957, Annan attended the elite Mfantsipim, an all-boys Methodist boarding school in Cape Coast founded in the 1870s. Annan said that the school taught him that suffering anywhere concerns people everywhere. In 1957, the year Annan graduated from Mfantsipim, the Gold Coast gained independence from the UK and began using the name Ghana. In 1958, Annan began studying economics at the Kumasi College of Science and Technology, now the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology of Ghana. He received a Ford Foundation grant, enabling him to complete his undergraduate studies in economics at Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota, U.S., in 1961. Annan then completed a Diplôme d'études approfondies degree in international relations at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, Switzerland, from 1961 to 1962. After some years of work experience, he studied at the MIT Sloan School of Management, 1971 to 72, in the Sloan Fellows Program and earned a master's degree in management. Annan was fluent in English, French, Akan, and some Kru languages as well as other African languages. In 1962, Annan started working as a budget officer for the World Health Organization, an agency of the United Nations, UN. From 1974 to 1976, he worked as a manager of the state-owned Ghana Tourist Development Company in Accra. In 1980 he became the head of personnel for the Office of the UN High Commission for Refugees, UNCRR, in Geneva. Between 1981 and 1983, he was a member of the governing board of the International School of Geneva. In 1983 he became the Director of Administrative Management Services of the UN Secretariat in New York. In 1987, Annan was appointed as an Assistant Secretary General for Human Resources Management and Security Coordinator for the UN system. In 1990, he became Assistant Secretary General for Program Planning, Budget, and Finance, and Control. 21. When Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali established the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, DPKO, in 1992, Annan was appointed to the new department as deputy to then Under-Secretary General Marek Golding. 23. Annan replaced Golding in March 1993 as Under-Secretary General of that department after American officials persuaded Boutros-Ghali that Annan was more flexible and more aligned with the role that the Pentagon expected of UN peacekeepers in Somalia. On August 29, 1995, while Boutros-Ghali was unreachable on an aeroplane, Annan instructed United Nations officials to relinquish for a limited period of time their authority to veto airstrikes in Bosnia. This move allowed NATO forces to conduct Operation Deliberate Force and made him a favorite of the United States. According to Richard Holbrooke, Annan's gutsy performance convinced the United States that he would be a good replacement for Boutros-Ghali. He was appointed a special representative of the Secretary General to the former Yugoslavia, serving from November 1995 to March 1996. In 2003, retired Canadian General Romeo Dallaire, who was force commander of the United Nations Assistance Mission for Rwanda, UNAMIR, claimed that Annan was overly passive in his response to the imminent genocide. In his book Shake Hands with the Devil, The Failure of Humanity in Rwanda, 2003, Dallaire asserted that Annan held back UN troops from intervening to settle the conflict and from providing more logistical and material support. Dallaire claimed that Annan failed to respond to his repeated faxes asking for access to a weapons depository. Such weapons could have helped Dallaire defend the endangered Tutsis. In 2004, 10 years after the genocide in which an estimated 800,000 people were killed, Annan said, "I could and should have done more to sound the alarm and rally support." In his book Interventions, A Life in War and Peace, Annan again argued that the United Nations Department of Peacekeeping Operations could have made better use of the media to raise awareness of the violence in Rwanda and put pressure on governments to provide the troops necessary for an intervention. Annan explained that the events in Somalia and the collapse of the UNOSOM II mission fostered a hesitation among UN member states to approve robust peacekeeping operations. As a result, when the UNAMIR mission was approved just days after the battle, the resulting force lacked the troop levels, resources, and mandate to operate effectively. In 1996, Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali ran unopposed for a second term. Although he won 14 of the 15 votes on the Security Council, he was vetoed by the United States. After 4 deadlocked meetings of the Security Council, Boutros-Ghali suspended his candidacy, becoming the only Secretary General ever to be denied a second term. Annan was the leading candidate to replace him, beating Amara Essay by 1 vote in the first round. However, France vetoed Annan 4 times before finally abstaining. The UN Security Council recommended Annan on December 13, 1996. Confirmed 4 days later by the vote of the General Assembly, he started his first term as Secretary General on January 1, 1997. Due to Boutros-Ghali's overthrow, a second Annan term would give Africa the office of Secretary General for 3 consecutive terms. In 2001, the Asia-Pacific Group agreed to support Annan for a second term in return for the African Group's support for an Asian Secretary General in the 2006 selection. The Security Council recommended Annan for a second term on June 27, 2001, and the General Assembly approved his reappointment on June 29, 2001. Soon after taking office in 1997, Annan released 2 reports on management reform. On March 17, 1997, the report Management and Organizational Measures, A/51/829, introduced new management mechanisms through the establishment of a cabinet-style body to assist him and the UN's activities in accordance with 4 core missions. A comprehensive reform agenda was issued on July 14, 1997 titled Renewing the United Nations, a Program for Reform, A/51/950. Key proposals included the introduction of strategic management to strengthen unity of purpose, the establishment of the position of Deputy Secretary General, a 10% reduction in posts, a reduction in administrative costs, the consolidation of the UN at the country level, and reaching out to civil society and the private sector as partners. Annan also proposed to hold a Millennium Summit in 2000. After years of research, Annan presented a progress report, In Larger Freedom, to the UN General Assembly on March 21, 2005. Annan recommended Security Council expansion and a host of other UN reforms. On January 31, 2006, Annan outlined his vision for a comprehensive and extensive reform of the UN in a policy speech to the United Nations Association UK. The speech, delivered at Central Hall, Westminster, also marked the 60th anniversary of the first meetings of the General Assembly and Security Council. On March 7, 2006, he presented to the General Assembly his proposals for a fundamental overhaul of the United Nations Secretariat. The reform report is titled Investing in the United Nations, for a Stronger Organization Worldwide. On March 30, 2006, he presented to the General Assembly his analysis and recommendations for updating the entire work program of the United Nations Secretariat. The reform report is titled Mandating and Delivering, Analysis and Recommendations to Facilitate the Review of Mandates. Regarding the UN Human Rights Council, Annan said declining credibility had cast a shadow on the reputation of the United Nations system. Unless we remake our human rights machinery, we may be unable to renew public confidence in the United Nations itself. He believed that, despite its flaws, the Council could do good. In March 2000, Annan appointed the Panel on United Nations Peace Operations to assess the shortcomings of the then existing system and to make specific and realistic recommendations for change. The panel was composed of individuals experienced in conflict prevention, peacekeeping, and peacebuilding. The report it produced, which became known as the Brahimi Report, after the chair of the panel Lakhdar Brahimi, called for renewed political commitment on the part of member states, significant institutional change, and increased financial support. The panel further noted that to be effective, UN peacekeeping operations must be adequately resourced and equipped, and operate under clear, credible, and achievable mandates. In a letter transmitting the report to the General Assembly and Security Council, Annan stated that the panel's recommendations were essential to making the United Nations truly credible as a force for peace. Later that same year, the Security Council adopted several provisions relating to peacekeeping following the report, in Resolution 1327. In 2000, Annan issued a report titled We the Peoples, The Role of the United Nations in the 21st Century. The report called for member states to put people at the center of everything we do. No calling is more noble, and no responsibility greater, than that of enabling men, women, and children, in cities and villages around the world, to make their lives better. In the final chapter of the report, Annan called to free our fellow men and women from the abject and dehumanizing poverty in which more than 1 billion of them are currently confined. At the Millennium Summit in September 2000, national leaders adopted the Millennium Declaration, which the United Nations Secretariat subsequently implemented as the Millennium Development Goals in 2001. Within the We the Peoples document, Annan suggested the establishment of a United Nations Information Technology Service, UNITES, a consortium of high-tech volunteer corps, including NetCore Canada and NetCore America, which United Nations volunteers, UNV, would coordinate. In the report of the high-level panel of experts on information and communication technology suggesting a UN ICT task force, the panel welcomed the establishment of UNITES. It made suggestions on its configuration and implementation strategy, including that ICT-4D volunteering opportunities make mobilizing national human resources, local ICT experts, within developing countries a priority for both men and women. The initiative was launched at the UNV and was active from February 2001 to February 2005. Initiative staff and volunteers participated in the World Summit on the Information Society, WSIS, in Geneva in December 2003. In an address to the World Economic Forum on January 31, 1999, Annan argued that the goals of the United Nations and those of business can, indeed, be mutually supportive and proposed that the private sector and the United Nations initiate a global compact of shared values and principles, which will give a human face to the global market. On July 26, 2000, the United Nations Global Compact was officially launched at UN headquarters in New York. It is a principle-based framework for businesses which aims to catalyze actions in support of broader UN goals, such as the Millennium Development Goals, MDGs. The compact established 10 core principles in the areas of human rights, labor, the environment, and anti-corruption. Under the compact, companies commit to the 10 principles and are brought together with UN agencies, labor groups, and civil society to implement them effectively. Towards the end of the 1990s, increased awareness of the destructive potential of epidemics such as HIV/AIDS pushed public health issues to the top of the global development agenda. In April 2001, Annan issued a 5-point call to action to address the HIV/AIDS pandemic. Stating it was a personal priority, Annan proposed the establishment of a global AIDS and health fund, dedicated to the battle against HIV/AIDS and other infectious diseases, to stimulate the increased international spending needed to help developing countries confront the HIV/AIDS crisis. In June of that year, the General Assembly of the United Nations committed to creating such a fund during a special session on AIDS, and the Permanent Secretariat of the Global Fund was subsequently established in January 2002. Following the failure of Annan and the international community to intervene in the genocide in Rwanda and in Srebrenica, Annan asked whether the international community had an obligation in such situations to intervene to protect civilian populations. In a speech to the General Assembly on September 20, 1999, to address the prospects for human security and intervention in the next century, Annan argued that individual sovereignty, the protections afforded by the Declaration of Human Rights and the Charter of the UN, was being strengthened, while the notion of state sovereignty was being redefined by globalization and international cooperation. As a result, the UN and its member states had to consider a willingness to act to prevent conflict and civilian suffering, a dilemma between two concepts of sovereignty that Annan also presented in a preceding article in The Economist on September 16, 1999. In the March 2000 Millennium Report to the UN, Annan asked, if humanitarian intervention is, indeed, an unacceptable assault on sovereignty, how should we respond to a Rwanda, to a Srebrenica, to gross and systematic violations of human rights that affect every precept of our common humanity? In September 2001, the Canadian government established an ad hoc committee to address this balance between state sovereignty and humanitarian intervention. The International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty published its final report in 2001, which focused not on the right of states to intervene but on a responsibility to protect populations at risk. The report moved beyond military intervention, arguing that various diplomatic and humanitarian actions could also be utilized to protect civilian populations. In 2005, Annan included the doctrine of responsibility to protect, RTOP, in his report In Larger Freedom. 64 When the UN General Assembly endorsed that report, it amounted to the first formal endorsement by UN member states of the doctrine of RTOP. In the years after 1998, when UNSCOM was expelled by the government of Saddam Hussein, and during the Iraq disarmament crisis, in which the United States blamed UNSCOM and former IAEA Director Hans Blix for failing to disarm Iraq properly. Former UNSCOM Chief Weapons Inspector Scott Ritter blamed Annan for being slow and ineffective in enforcing Security Council resolutions on Iraq and was overtly submissive to the demands of the Clinton administration for regime removal and inspection of sites. Often presidential palaces, that were not mandated in any resolution and were of questionable intelligence value, severely hampering UNSCOM's ability to cooperate with the Iraqi government and contributed to their expulsion from the country. Ritter also claimed that Annan regularly interfered with the work of the inspectors and diluted the chain of command by trying to micromanage all of the activities of UNSCOM, which caused intelligence processing, and the resulting inspections, to be backed up and caused confusion with the Iraqis as to who was in charge, and as a result, they generally refused to take orders from Ritter or Rolf Ekus without explicit approval from Annan, which could have taken days, if not weeks. He later believed Annan was oblivious that the Iraqis took advantage of this to delay inspections. He claimed that on one occasion, Annan refused to implement a no-notice inspection of the Iraqi Special Security Organization, SSO, headquarters and instead tried to negotiate access. Still, the negotiation took nearly 6 weeks, giving the Iraqis more than enough time to clean the site. During the build-up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, Annan called on the United States and the United Kingdom not to invade without the support of the United Nations. In a September 2004 interview on the BBC, when questioned about the legal authority for the invasion, Annan said he believed it was not in conformity with the UN Charter and was illegal. In 1998, Annan was deeply involved in supporting the transition from military to civilian rule in Nigeria. The following year, he supported the efforts of East Timor to secure independence from Indonesia. In 2000, he was responsible for certifying Israel's withdrawal from Lebanon, and in 2006, he led talks in New York between the presidents of Cameroon and Nigeria, which led to a settlement of the dispute between the two countries over the Bakassi Peninsula. Annan and Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad disagreed sharply on Iran's nuclear program, on an Iranian exhibition of cartoons mocking the Holocaust, and on the then upcoming international conference to review the global vision of the Holocaust, an Iranian Holocaust denial conference in 2006. During a visit to Iran instigated by continued Iranian uranium enrichment, Annan said, "I think the tragedy of the Holocaust is an undeniable historical fact, and we should really accept that fact and teach people what happened in World War II and ensure it is never repeated." Annan supported sending a UN peacekeeping mission to Darfur, Sudan. He worked with the government of Sudan to accept a transfer of power from the African Union peacekeeping mission to a UN one. Annan also worked with several Arab and Muslim countries on women's rights and other topics. Beginning in 1998, Annan convened an annual UN Security Council retreat with the 15 States Council representatives. It was held at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, RBF, Conference Center at the Rockefeller Family Estate in Pocantico Hills, New York, and was sponsored by both the RBF and the UN. In June 2004, Annan was given a copy of the Office of Internal Oversight Services, OIOS, report on the complaint brought by 4 female workers against Ruud Lubbers, UN High Commissioner for Refugees, for sexual harassment, abuse of authority, and retaliation. The report also reviewed a long-serving staff member's allegations of sexual harassment and misconduct against Werner Blatter, director of UNRWA personnel. The investigation found Lubbers guilty of sexual harassment. No mention was made publicly of the other charge against a senior official or 2 subsequent complaints filed later that year. During the official investigation, Lubbers wrote a letter which some considered a threat to the female worker who had brought the charges. On July 15, 2004, Annan cleared Lubbers of the accusations, saying they were not substantial enough legally. The internal UN, OIOS report on Lubbers was leaked, and sections accompanied by an article by Kate Holt were published in a British newspaper. In February 2005, Lubbers resigned as head of the UN Refugee Agency, saying he wanted to relieve political pressure on Annan. In December 2004, reports surfaced that the Secretary-General's son Kofi Annan received payments from the Swiss company Kotna Inspection SA, which had won a lucrative contract under the UN Oil for Food program. Kofi Annan called for an investigation to look into the allegations. On November 11, 2005, the Sunday Times agreed to apologize and pay a substantial sum in damages to Kofi Annan, accepting that the allegations were untrue. Annan appointed the Independent Inquiry Committee, which was led by former U.S. Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker, then the director of the United Nations Association of the U.S. In his first interview with the Inquiry Committee, Annan denied meeting with Kotna. Later in the inquiry, he recalled having met with Kotna's chief executive Elie Georges Massy twice. In a final report issued on October 27, the committee found insufficient evidence to indict Annan on any illegal actions but did find fault with Benon Sevan, an Armenian Cypriot national who had worked for the UN for about 40 years. Appointed by Annan to the Oil for Food role, Sevan repeatedly asked Iraqis for allocations of oil to the African Middle East Petroleum Company. Sevan's behavior was ethically improper, Volcker said to reporters. Sevan repeatedly denied the charges and argued that he was being made a scapegoat. The Volcker report was highly critical of the UN management structure and the Security Council oversight. It strongly recommended a new chief operating officer, COO, position to handle the fiscal and administrative responsibilities then under the Secretary-General's office. The report listed the Western and Middle Eastern companies that had benefited illegally from the program. In 2001, its centennial year, the Nobel Committee decided that the Peace Prize was to be divided between the UN and Annan. They were awarded the Peace Prize for their work for a better organized and more peaceful world, having revitalized the UN and prioritized human rights. The Nobel Committee also recognized his commitment to the struggle to contain the spread of HIV in Africa and his declared opposition to international terrorism. Soon after Annan was awarded the Peace Prize, he was given a chieftaincy title by the Asante of Ashanti man. The honor was conferred upon him for his selfless contributions to humanity and promotion of peace throughout the world. Annan defended his Deputy Secretary-General Mark Malloch Brown, who openly criticized the United States in a speech on June 6, 2006, the prevailing practice of seeking to use the UN almost by stealth as a diplomatic tool while failing to stand up for it against its domestic critics is simply not sustainable. You will lose the UN one way or another. That the US is constructively engaged with the UN, is not well known or understood, in part because much of the public discourse that reaches the US heartland has been largely abandoned to its loudest detractors such as Rush Limbaugh and Fox News. Malloch later said his talk was a sincere and constructive critique of US policy toward the UN by a friend and admirer. The talk was unusual because it violated the unofficial policy of not having top officials publicly criticize member nations. The interim US ambassador John Bolton, appointed by President George W. Bush, was reported to have told Annan on the phone, "I've known you since 1989 and I'm telling you this is the worst mistake by a senior UN official that I have seen in that entire time." Observers from other nations supported Malloch's view that conservative politicians in the US prevented many citizens from understanding the benefits of US involvement in the UN. On September 19, 2006, Annan gave a farewell address to world leaders gathered at the UN headquarters in New York in anticipation of his retirement on December 31. In the speech, he outlined three major problems of an unjust world economy, world disorder, and widespread contempt for human rights and the rule of law, which he believed have not resolved, but sharpened during his time as Secretary General. He also pointed to violence in Africa and the Arab-Israeli conflict as two major issues warranting attention. On December 11, 2006, in his final speech as Secretary General, delivered at the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library in Independence, Missouri, Annan recalled President Truman's leadership in the founding of the United Nations. He called for the United States to return to Truman's multilateralist foreign policies and to follow Truman's doctrine that the responsibility of the great states is to serve and not dominate the peoples of the world. He also said that the United States must maintain its commitment to human rights, including in the struggle against terrorism. Thank you for watching this video. May his soul rest in eternal peace.